everyone. Welcome to the 18th episode here in the ongoing series in Farm Chatter, Spanish Jewry Through the Ages. On this episode, I was joined by Professor Marc Shapiro, who first time on the podcast in a long time, one of the original guests on the podcast, and we discussed a very early, maybe the first article of his, but a very early article of his, which is titled The Cherem on Spain, History and Halacha. And we discussed the Cherem, the so-called ban, so-called Cherem on living in Spain that many listeners may be familiar with or may have heard of. So we discussed it. Was it real? Where did it come from? Etc. Things like that. If anyone is interested in the article, I have a PDF. You can email me or you can join the Farm Chatter WhatsApp community where I'll post it together with this podcast episode. But you can email me, svarmchatter@gmail.com for that. Additionally, we mentioned this in the episode, but there is a full-length, well, it's not a full-length book, but it's about 100 pages, almost a full-length book, half a book, 100 pages, about dedicated to this question called Kunditin by Rabbi Chiel Goldhaber, and the other half is about the Titanic. If you're interested in this, Eliezer Brot does have, that's where I got my copy from. I shouldn't say he does have. I think so. You can reach out to him, eliezerbrutt@gmail.com, and you can email him and ask him if you're interested in a copy of this work and you want to read more, go really in depth in this, on this topic. This was more, on the episode here was less than that. As always, I want to thank the corporate sponsor of this series, Gluck Plumbing, for all your service needs, big or small, in New Jersey, with a full-service division from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, camp-ring main lines, to a simple faucet leak. Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. Again, 732-523-1836, extension 1. If you would like to sponsor an episode in this series, if you'd like to sponsor an episode on the podcast, which is $360, or to support the podcast in any way, now there's intro music, there is a microphone, better software, better things going on, working on various different things. But any monetary amounts, very much appreciated. You can email me, just svarmchatter@gmail.com. You can use that for Chase QuickPay, Zelle. Also, there's a link via PayPal in the show's notes if you're interested. And again, I appreciate it. Also, if you can subscribe to the podcast, Apple Podcasts, 24/6, Spotify, wherever you listen to. And if it's via Apple, thank you to all those who have. But if you haven't, if you can please rate the podcast. And if you would like to, you can leave a review as well. It does help the podcast. So I appreciate all those who have. And I appreciate if you would think about doing it. Enjoy this episode, again, number 18, and this is really as the series is winding down, finally. I know it's been long. I hope listeners enjoy it. I'm looking for more feedback on it, what you liked about the series, what you didn't like, what you thought could have been improved on, and especially feedback that will help for the next series. So the next series is just about complete. This series has one more episode. Maybe there'll be some sort of finale afterwards, but right now there's one more episode next week, and then maybe a little break, and then it's going to be the 10 Lost Tribes in Jewish consciousness. So about the Taseres HaShvatim, the 10 Lost Tribes, and various historical figures associated with them and stories, and I think it's a lot of fun and really fascinating material. But for that podcast series, also I'm working on a new series now, so if you have feedback about what you liked about this or what you didn't like, what you'd like to be similar to Shapsei Tzvi or not, whatever, any especially constructive feedback that I can use for future episodes, I'd appreciate it. And if you could email me with that kind of feedback, svarmchatter@gmail.com, and enjoy this episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Farm Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Marc Shapiro, who is the Weinberg Chair in Judaic Studies at the University of Scranton. And we will be discussing the quote-unquote, quotation marks, Cherem on Spain and living in Spain and traveling to Spain. So this is another entry in the series on Spanish Jewry and the Jews of Spain. And we will be discussing that. So thank you, Professor Shapiro, for joining me. Well, I would say once again, but the first time wasn't exactly the podcast. We're still doing it live way back when. So this is kind of the first time just exclusively on the podcast, so to speak.
Good to be here.
Okay, so let's start off with the Cherem on Spain. As I understand, I think this is one of the earliest things that you wrote, I think, an article. And let's talk about this so-called Cherem that a lot of people are probably very familiar with.
Okay, actually, this is my first academic article written when I was still in college. I look back at it a little, I don't know what I should say. If I could write it today, it would be a lot more sophisticated. I read it, it reads like a college term paper. But okay, it's the first thing I ever wrote. And it appeared in the journal Sefarad. Sefarad is a journal of Jewish studies, basically biblical studies, published in Spain. It's been for many, many decades. It's in Spain. It's been published in Spain even before there was any real Jewish life in Spain. And I thought it would be suitable to publish it there. And should I talk about what I found, or do you want to?
We'll talk about it. Actually, let me just ask you. So you said you were in college. You wrote this way back when. How did you decide you're going to research this topic of the first paper, thing you really wrote, the Cherem of Spain?
When I was taking a course in history of Spain, medieval period to 1492, with Professor Aaron Katchen at Brandeis University, and so we're reading the classic works, Yitzhak Bear, and all the important writings. And I had seen actually a reference, as I recall, in one of Rabbi Blech's books regarding the Cherem on Spain. And since even then I wasn't a medievalist, I wanted to find a way that my research paper could be more modern focused, even though it's a course in medieval Jewish history. So how better to do that than to deal with how modern rabbinic figures have viewed Spain. So Dr. Katchen said, fine, and I got to work.
Okay, so let's start actually with this Cherem. What is the so-called Cherem? What is it? And then, what'd you find? And we'll work through that.
Well, there is a tradition that when the Jews were expelled from Spain, that they put a Cherem on it. That would be the rabbis put a ban that Jews could never return to Spain. I'm not sure whether this is supposed to be a punishment for the Spanish. I mean, they're very happy not to have the Jews. So I'm not sure how us not going back hurts them. Or it's just supposed to be that the land is such tumah or so wicked that we would never want to step foot there again. It's definitely an oral tradition because we don't have, until the 20th century, we don't have any written text speaking about it, although we do in the 19th century have, for example, Yalag, Yehuda Abe Gordon speaks about that he's portraying the exile from Spain. So command your children, he says, concerning Spain, not to return. So that seems to be the Cherem. So I guess you would say, ironically, that's the first reference we have to the Cherem, Yehuda Abe Gordon, second half of the 19th century, assuming that's an actual Cherem as opposed to just good advice. Don't go back to Spain, because if you went back to Spain, you could be executed. So I'm not sure what Yalag is referring to. But by the early 20th century, we know there was such a notion because we have, for example, Rav Kook was asked about this, and we have others asked about it. So it definitely was you got to assume by the 19th century, this was a common perception that there is an actual Cherem. And the reason this would come up in the 19th century is because now Jews could return. So precisely when Jews have a possibility of returning, it makes sense that people would say, no, you can't return. Why not? Because there is a ban against us returning.
So, as you say, there's no mention of it till the 19th century. But were there who else looked into this, and what kind of proofs do we have that it doesn't exist? So let's say someone will say, okay, there's no, it's oral tradition. So how do we have? What proofs can we have to say no? There probably was no Cherem.
Well, first of all, there's no reference in any of the rabbinic writings. The Jews from Spain, most of them ended up going to North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and they were great rabbis, including some of the most famous names in our history. They wrote many Sfarim, and you would assume that in one of the books, someone would have, in which they talk about Spain, they talk about the Minhagim, they talk about the exiles. You would assume that someone would have mentioned anywhere in these large corpus of writings that there is actually a Cherem, a ban not to go back to Spain. That's the whole point of a Cherem. If you don't publicize it and let people know, it has no value, it has no validity. Furthermore, we have what seems to be an explicit text that shows us that there was no Cherem, because in Sfat, the Mabit, Moshe Trani, discusses a case where in those days, it's not like today where you go to any shul you wanted to go to. In those days, you had to belong to a certain community, and they determined where you came from. And then, so for example, if you're from Italian descent, you belong to one community, and then they divided it. Um, so if you come from Spanish descent, even though you haven't been there in a while, you would belong to the Spanish community. And the question was about, can you change your communities? And the Mabit mentions, or how far back, let's say it's your great 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 grandparents, is that still behind you? That's the sort of thing he's discussing. And the issue that he raises is that, okay, so let's say you're from the Italian community. Granted that maybe you weren't born in Italy, but you can still go back to Italy, and that could be your home. But he says about speaking about the Jews from Spain, Aragon in particular, he says that it's been a long time since the number of generations since they've been there, and we I can read you the exact writings, perhaps if I can find it here. He says that we do not expect anyone yes, he says that there have been no Jews in Aragon for 70 years, and we're confident that no Jew will live there anymore. Why not? Because God will bring us everyone back to the land of Israel. This is a messianic sort of wish. So he doesn't say that we're confident no one's going to live there because there's a Cherem. He says we're confident no one's going to live there because by the time they decide to let the Jews back, Mashiach will have come and we'll all be living in Eretz Yisrael. So that's about as clear cut as you can get that no official Cherem was put on it. Otherwise, he would have said that no one's going to go back there because the exiles declared a Cherem. But even without that, as I said, there's no reference in any of the great rabbis who discuss Spain and people who come from Spain, people who go back to Spain. That was a big problem. Jews would go back to Spain for business purposes. And the rabbis, of course, are very opposed to this because going back to Spain means that you have to make believe you're Christian and violate all sorts of Isurim while you're doing that. But no one ever says in all the discussions, well, in addition to all the Isurim you're violating, you're also violating the Cherem.
And interestingly, also, you mentioned that other Rabbanim, we know Rabbi Yaakov Sasportas went back, and there were other Rabbanim that also went back, and other Jews. So if there really was an issue, how would they have gone back?
Yeah, they were times that on diplomatic in Morocco, for instance, the ruler of Morocco liked to use Jews to send them to Spain. So Yaakov Sasportas went back, and others for diplomatic purposes. And again, in all the discussions of it, no one even raises it to say, well, why was he allowed to go back? What about the Cherem? So then they could have said, well, he was special, he was Karav Malchus or something like that. But no one mentions it, no one raises it. It's a non-issue until the 19th century.
So interestingly, because as I mentioned, growing up, I always recall hearing of the so-called Cherem, and in my mind, what I recall, it was 500 years, or there was some certain length of time that this lasted. So where did this persistent kind of idea of the Cherem come from? If it's not in any literature, there were a lot of Jews were going to Spain. It wasn't seemingly a real thing. It came from somewhere.
Yeah, and when Jews start returning to Morocco, the end of the 19th century, no one really mentions this. But as you say, it's something people heard. And what I argue in the article, and where I think it probably comes from, is that the rabbis were very opposed to Jews going back to Spain for the very reason I mentioned, that it would require you to violate all sorts of Isurim, and we have various takanot and haskamot that say, we're talking Spanish communities in London, elsewhere, that if a Jew does go back to Spain, when they return, they're not going to be able to give an aliyah, they have to do certain penances. So functionally, there was a ban against Jews going back to Spain, not in the sense of a cherem and that there's something wrong with the land, but as long as it was dangerous to go back, a matter of life and death, the rabbis said that it's absolutely forbidden to go back. And if you do go back, there are various punishments you're going to get when you return. So that's where the idea comes from, a cherem on Spain. But it's not a cherem on the land of Spain. It's a prohibition on going to Spain when Judaism was illegal. According to the text of the expulsion, that a Jew would be executed for being in Spain. So that's where it comes from. So it's, I guess you could say, it's a quasi-cherem of sorts, but not in the way that people thought of.
It's not the traditional cherem. It's more like just this was an idea, better not to go.
Well, no, because it's necessary to go because you'd have to live as a Christian, and there's no kosher food or anything there. So that's why they said you couldn't go. But so once Spain then opens up to Jews, and you could live there, and synagogues were established, then you have people asking, "Why are you allowed to do this? Because isn't there a cherem on Spain?" But again, there never was a cherem per se on Spain. There was a prohibition or a ban, and not even official ban, but an unofficial of going to a place, any place that would be, where you have to live as a Christian. Once that's no longer a problem, there's no longer an issue. And that was the psak given by all the Gedolim who were asked about it almost entirely. That was the psak given.
So, but just to finish here on this part is, so essentially there was no real cherem. So do we know where this idea that people have in their head that there is a cherem comes from? Who said there was?
I think the idea came from people extrapolating from the fact that the rabbis forbid and made declarations that no Jew is allowed to go back there. So in the popular mind, that sounds very much like a cherem. And although it was never issued as a cherem, but again, as I said, it's against the Spain of the inquisitorial era. It's not against the land. There never was a cherem issued against the land. And over time, this idea developed, I think, extrapolating from the very real prohibition that the rabbis issued of returning to a land when your life would be put in danger if you observe Torah and mitzvahs.
So then you mentioned that when Jews start returning. So then this becomes a halachic question: are Jews allowed to go back once Jews are allowed back into Spain? So this becomes just kind of there were halachic questions that arose regarding this, especially because there was a so-called cherem, right?
Well, actually, in the early years, there was no such no one really raised this issue. It's only after the community was already established then people started asking questions about this, and they turned, for example, to Rav Kook, and all pretty much every chief rabbi of the state of Israel was asked about this question, and this became an issue before the Holocaust when Jews had to leave Germany, and one of the places, ironically, that they were allowed to enter in certain numbers was Spain. Franco, who was a fascist, who was allied with Hitler in many respects, although he's neutral in the war, allowed Jews to enter Spain. It's very interesting as to why he did this. It's even been speculated that he has perhaps Jewish blood in him, like so many others in Spain. The name Franco, those who know the Syrian community know, it's a Jewish name. It's also a non-Jewish name. So then you also have the issue raised: is it permissible to go to Spain? And I think until about 30 years ago, it kept being brought up and brought up. I can't imagine today anyone even brings it up. We have big communities, or decent size, I should say, communities in Madrid and in Barcelona and other places. You have Rabbanim there, you have Chabad there, and I lead tours there, and no one has ever raised the issue with me in the last 30 years. But there was a time when it was thought to be significant. There was a rabbi in Brooklyn named Meir Amsel when he edited this journal called Hamaor, and when in this, I can't remember if in the 60s or the 70s, when Spain, it's in the 60s, the late 60s, when Rabbi Solomon Gaon, who was a Sephardi, he was the Chacham of the Spanish and Portuguese community in London, when he traveled to Spain to mark the inauguration of the new synagogue, Rabbi Amsel harshly attacks him with all sorts of inappropriate language, as he was accustomed to do. But at that time, it was still thought by some people, at least, that there was a cherem. Now, Rabbi Gaon went there. There already was a synagogue and already was a community. So it didn't make much sense to be attacking Rabbi Gaon for going there. But that's the reality.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned in the article some others, the Minchas Elazar. Yeah, you mentioned Rav Kook. You mentioned I don't know if you made there's others in there. Another one that I wanted to mention that you referred to Tzitz Eliezer. So there's a lot of halachic questions coming up, but as you say, it kind of became accepted. So kind of it's interesting, first of all, that the cherem idea is still persistent. I don't know. I always, like I said, I not thinking myself, but I'm sure listeners grew up like with this idea that there was a cherem, even though, as you say, people live in Spain, people go to Spain, people travel to Spain. I think you give tours to Spain, so this is like commonplace.
And in fact, every rabbi who's asked about it basically says that there's no issue, there's no problem, it's not true. The one exception is actually Rav Uziel, who was Sephardic chief rabbi of Eretz Yisrael, and this is quoted by the Tzitzelator of Waldemar. Rav Uziel said, even though there's no source for it, since there's such a tradition, therefore, when the Jews of Spain asked him to send rabbis, spiritual leaders for, at the time, the small community in Spain. He says we would evade it. That is, they would not they would not send rabbis there. And Rabbi Waldenberg, based upon that, is afraid to permit people to go live there. Many people assume that it was to live there, not to visit there, but um, that's a minority opinion. The mainstream opinion, in fact, Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg also raises it, believe it or not. For a while, I didn't understand what how he raised this, because he has there's a responsum to him by Rav Susmanovitz of Gedolim, who was killed, dealing with this to Rabbi Weinberg. And when did Rabbi Weinberg ever raise this issue? However, at the I found an original copy, which in Jerusalem, at the Jewish National Library, of Rabbi Weinberg's responsum on stunning animals before shechita, or stunning chicken. I forget which one it is. And he sent this out to all the Gedolim. At the end of it, he has a little footnote saying, and raising the issue also, and what about the Cherem on Spain? Wanted to hear what the rabbis have to say. But it's as you mentioned, it's Rov Minyan Ubinyan of Gedol Yisrael assume that there's no issue with this at all. Rav Kook was asked about it. Rav Herzog was asked about it. I asked Rav Shapiro about this. Rav Vad Yosef and Rav Mordechai Eliyahu. They all assume that this is not an issue, and you can go to Spain and enjoy it. And not be troubled by violating any cherem there at the moment. In fact, the Council of European Rabbis has had their gatherings in Spain as well, and none other than Rav Vad Yosef traveled there, and where he met with the king at the time.
Interesting. The other one, I mentioned this earlier, there's this idea that the cherem was for X amount of years, 400 years, 500 years. Do we know where that came from?
No, and there's no source for that at all. Perhaps building upon ideas of Cherem Durban Gershom as having temporary validity, because the idea is that a Cherem is not supposed to be permanent, it's supposed to be of limited duration, and then the people, if they accept it, it's extended. But there's no source for this, because there is no source for the idea of the Cherem. The first person to investigate this was A.S. Avram Shalom Yehuda. He was a Sephardic Jew from Jerusalem, and he was appointed during the early part of the 20th century to be professor in Spain, in Madrid. And he was professor of Jewish studies there. And he writes, he has an article in Talpiot where he writes that he too investigated it. And he's known for writing a number of important works in Hebrew and also in English about the Jews in Mitzrayim, things of that nature. And he's the first one, I think, to really investigate it. And also came up with nothing. This was in 1915. He was offered a chair in Jewish studies at the University of Madrid.
Wow. So I will mention first of all for listeners that I can send them they can email you or me. I have if they're interested in reading the article. But we also should make mention that Michiel Goldhaber was been on the podcast a number of times. He has an entire work that he wrote on this, right? Kunditin. I think it's dedicated mostly to this. I think it's some other things in there as well.
Yes, he has a work called Konditon, in which he has 100 pages on the Cherem in Spain, and the second part of the book deals with Jewish responses to the Titanic, the sinking of the Titanic. So he also cites many sources and uncovers some new sources as well. But the basic point which I'm making is, I guess, elaborated on and affirmed by him, that there's no source, and that it derives from this notion that Jews were strongly discouraged, even forbidden from returning during inquisitorial times.
Yeah, so if I find information on how to get that, I'm not sure if it's still available anymore. I'll put that in the show's notes. But your article, Professor Shapiro, I have, and I can put, people can email about that. Now, I want to ask you, interestingly, though, postscript on the article that you wrote a while ago is, but like I mentioned, you give tours of Spain. So you go to Spain. I mean, Jews did return to Spain. There's communities there that you mentioned. So what's the current situation like in Spain, from you as an outsider, someone that goes there?
Yeah. Well, actually, Jews have been living in Spain, that is Iberia, the peninsula, for a long time because they were living in Gibraltar. Gibraltar was when Spain gave Gibraltar to the English as part of their agreement there. The English had to agree not to allow Jews to settle in Gibraltar, an agreement which they immediately violated and began welcoming Jews for economic reasons. And these Jews have been living there for hundreds of years, except from the 1700s. They came from Morocco, and with the return of Jews, the end of the 19th century or the early 20th century, these are mostly Moroccan Jews. At least that's how it would have been through most of the 20th century. During the war, you had Ashkenazic Jews living there as well. Today, you find Jews of all types, although the Nusach is basically Moroccan in the shuls. There is someone who put together a Spanish Nusach sitter, but from the old Spanish Nusach, actually Catalonian. Let me take that back. For in Barcelona, but no one uses it as far as I know. And you have Israelis down there, you have Ashkenazi there, you have, I think the figures they gave is about 5,000 in Barcelona, 5,000 in Madrid, and you have smaller communities in other places. You have on the coast in Malaga, you have in Marbella, you have people, you have Rabbanim there, you have kosher food, you have a place called Torremolinos, that you know it's a real Jewish community because there's a machokas over the kashrus there. You have these tourists and others. And when I was there once, you have a big sign saying, you can't eat here. It's not kosher enough. You can only eat at my place. And so you know that we've made it when you have machokas, even unfortunately there. But so you have a number of communities, and you have Chabad. You even have Chabad where there's no community in Girona. Girona, the place of Nachmanides, the Ramban, and so many other great Torah sages. There's no community there, but Chabad has a center there, and they try to sometimes have a minyan on the holidays because you have Jews living in little areas in the surrounding towns, but no official community there.
And Portugal as well?
Portugal, you have two communities in Portugal, or three, I should say. You have in Lisbon, and you have in Porto. Very nice shows in both. And then you have a place, Belmont, which is it's conversos who returned to Judaism in the last 40 years. They now have a shul there, a minyan on Shabbos. They've all been converted by the Rabbanut. So you have three functioning communities with shuls. And there's actually another one because a group of Hasidim recently moved to Portugal. They're working the land. And so they also have a little community. And Portugal is a wonderful place. You'll have more people going there. You have places where people in the summer people come. You can find a minyan, and but I would say there's two major communities in Portugal, in Porto and in Lisbon.
Okay, so just to flip back to the Cherem for a second, something I meant to ask you is, so this concept of Cherem on a place that was bad to Jews, do we have other instances of this in modern history? Thinking of Germany, but other countries in Europe which we know were bad to Jews throughout the centuries.
Well, the problem with the ban thing is that if they're going to start banning everywhere that Jews were, then there won't be many places for Jews to go. And we do have texts that refer to that you shouldn't go there. I mean, there's reports, don't go to the city of York, for instance, in England. That's where you had the great massacre there. And we have references, Cherem on Cherem, believe it or not, Cherem on Yafo. It's hard to get your hand around all these cherems, but we don't have anything in terms of an official cherem by all the Rabbanim. We have a report of this rabbi said this, but we don't. In the Ukraine, after a pogrom, places where they said you should not live there, nothing official. The only place where there actually was movement to have an official cherem, understandably, was after the Holocaust on Germany, where you had a number of figures who thought that an actual cherem should be established against Germany for what they did. And Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg was one of a number who was asked about this. And as far as I know, although many rabbis said you shouldn't step foot there, it's a terrible place to go, no, as far as I know, no one of any authority agreed on an official cherem. The reason is because Rabbi Yaakov Weinberg says that at the end of the day, people need parnasa, and there's going to be reasons to go to Germany, and we can't ban we can't say it's forbidden for Jews to go. If they, he said, Am Yisrael tzrichim parnasa, they need parnasa. And as far as I know, all the poskim who were asked about this said that we can't forbid a settlement there, and it's not a good thing. At the same time, by the way, that these rabbis were saying that you shouldn't go to Germany, and although technically you can't forbid it, I'll just note that there seemed to be no problem returning to Vienna, Austria, which is the center of Nazism. As soon as the war is over, all of a sudden they recreate the communities and Hasidim there, and everyone's there. And Austria is Germany during the war. They're one thing. And some of the leading Nazis, including Hitler, come from Austria. So I never quite understood this distinction between Austria and Germany. But if there was going to be a place where a cherem was placed on it, it would be Germany. And it never happened. And now if you look where we are now, you see that Germany is the Torah is learned in Germany, and there's lots of Jews. Germany is the only country in Europe where the Jewish population is growing. So I think maybe the lesson for all this is, and this is what has been the Jewish history, is that we've suffered terribly, and yet we've always understood that even though we suffered in this place, the next generation, this place, Dafka, could be a homeland for us and a refuge from where somewhere else is persecuting us. So Jews were thrown out of places, and then as soon as the authorities allowed them to come back in, they come back in, because that's what it was to be a Jew in the exile. You lived where they let you live, and you tried to make the best out of it. So we didn't keep grudges to the extent that there's an expression, you chop off your nose to spite your face. By us saying we're not going to live somewhere, Rabbi Weinberg says you're giving the Germans what they want anyway. So these cherems against places never really took off.
Yeah, as you said earlier, that's what Spain as well. That's what they wanted, the Spanish, the Portuguese. They wanted to get rid of the Jews. And I had a friend who I think, a kollel in Berlin for a few years. So, there are definitely people in Germany, like you said, it's a growing community now, and it's just it's an interesting thing. And people going back to Spain as well. As you mentioned, there are communities there. I'm sure there are Pesach programs there.
Well, of course, by the way, one of the rabbis who discusses the cherem says, obviously, we have to distinguish between during the days of the monarchy, when Jews were persecuted, and today. If you go to a place like Spain today, it's not a religious country. Officially, it's not religious, although most people are at least nominally Catholic. The government is officially secular, and most people, especially the young generation, are not practicing Catholic at all. It's a secular Western democracy, and the only problem, perhaps, there is anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiment, which, for instance, just last week, the mayor of Barcelona came out in favor of BDS. On the other hand, the mayor of Madrid, who's more conservative, came out with a strong affirmation of ties and support for Israel. Now, Barcelona is twinned with Tel Aviv. So if they stop the twinning, well, then Madrid says, we'll join with you. So unfortunately, in Spain, we have the same issues in many places in Europe, where there's a lot of anti-Israel, even anti-Semitic sentiment. But it's no different in Spain than anywhere else in Europe. That's just the reality we have to live with.
Yeah, unfortunately, exactly. Okay, so this is interesting. Hopefully, and I mentioned earlier, for those who want to learn more about this, they can email me for your article. They can read that. That's in English, and if they want more on it from Michiel Goldhaber.
I'll just mention one more thing. On my tours to Spain, I found something interesting. The very first day when we're on the bus, and before we start speaking about all the great things we're going to see, I asked, are we even allowed to be here? And I raised the issue and go through some of the sources. What has surprised me is that how few people ever even heard of the cherem. This is maybe more of a modern Orthodox audience as opposed to more Haredi Hasidic audience, but it's not even, as we say, a Havamina. It's most of them have never even heard of this concept, which I think maybe their parents or grandparents would have heard of it. So it's clearly there's been a change in understanding. And as I said, when you go to Spain, not only are there big Jewish communities there, you will see. You'll see Hasidim. You'll see all of our people there in all of its variety when you go to Spain today.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm curious. Like I said, I growing up, I I definitely heard of the Cherem, and I'm not asking everyone to email. I don't have a poll, something I can do for the podcast. I actually should find
Well,
if I
when you
could
were
put.
growing up, was it you heard that there had been a Cherem, or that you heard that there is currently a Cherem and there's a problem going to Spain?
I recall, what I recall hearing about that there was a Cherem and it was the 500-year type thing. I don't know, like expired. It was like a temporary thing. It was over. This is what I recall hearing, but I definitely heard of a Cherem. Like definitely growing up. So I'm curious if the listeners had the same thing or not, or like you're saying, they don't even know of the Cherem, and this whole episode of the podcast is interesting to them that they're hearing about that there was a discussion about a Cherem about Spain. Like I said, I don't know if I can find some sort of polling thing. Obviously, not everyone's going to email me yes or no. I mean, I'm always interested in feedback. If anyone wants to email me, say I heard of it or I didn't, you're welcome to. But I'm curious. I am curious if
Yeah,
listeners heard of this or not.
Rav Yosef Massas writes about his visit to Spain in the early part of the 20th century. Everything he saw, all that. He even mentions that he met a priest who knew Hebrew, and he has no mention at all of any Cherem. And he would have mentioned had he knew something about that. He was such a bibliophile, and so it's an interesting topic, but not so practically relevant, I would say. And anyone who wants to come to Spain and see the beautiful country, please join us.
Yeah, I actually should check. I forgot to check before this. I did a podcast episode recently on Rav Shem Tov Gagin and the author of Keser Shem Tov, and in one of the volumes of Minhag Nazim of Vat Shalom, they published a manuscript, his travels that he used to travel around. It was published by Roy Shasho. I interviewed, and he went to Spain. He actually was in Spain. He talked about a bunch of travels in Spain. So I'm curious. I was in the 30s. I remember. I'm curious what he writes there. I have to check in there. They published this from manuscript. What he says. Because he for sure he was the minhag guy. He
Yes,
checked all
he
the
might
minhagim.
mention that. Oh, I'll have to check that out also.
Yeah, I forget which volume offhand it is in Minhag Nazim. Okay, so like I said, people can email me for your article, and if I find a way about Goldhaber, if Michiel Goldhaber's book is available in any way, I'll put it in the show's notes. Thank you very much, Professor Shapiro, for joining me once again.
Thank you very much.